What's going on, everybody? I hope you're doing good. What I wanted to do today is talk with you through the book of Nehemiah, specifically just chapter 6, not the whole thing. And I was going through this in my personal devotion earlier this week, and it just really spoke to me about how we ought to respond to the attacks of the enemy in our own lives. Nehemiah, just give you a little bit of background, Nehemiah up to this point had been rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem. Judah specifically had been in captivity under the Babylonians for some years and had been allowed, whenever Babylon was conquered by the Persians, had been allowed to return home and start to rebuild their city. There had been a couple of returns up to this point, but the people had a really hard time. I think under Zerubbabel, they had tried to rebuild the temple, and they had a lot of issues simply because the city was kind of left unprotected. And so Nehemiah had heard about this. He had gone and inspected the walls, and it had broken his heart that his people were having such a difficult time to try to get reestablished back in their homeland. And so he felt very burdened to go back and to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. So far in our story in chapter 6, he is actually nearing completion of these walls. And as a result, his enemies, a lot of the people who had kind of moved into the region during the captivity, I think the names are specifically Sanballat is one of the leaders, and Geshem, I believe is how you pronounce that, had really given him a hard time. They had attempted to intimidate him. They had openly threatened them, and Nehemiah had even had some internal conflicts as well. But as the walls near completion, they realize, their time is short, and so they kind of amp up the attacks. However, the attacks become a little bit more subtle up to this point. And there are three ways in which they try to stop the progress and stop what Nehemiah was doing. The first is they try to distract Nehemiah. Secondly, they spread lies and slander about what's going on and what Nehemiah's motivations are. And finally, they just simply try to trick Nehemiah in an unusual way, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. First of all, they're trying to distract Nehemiah. If you look at chapter 6, it says in verse 2 that Sanballat and Geshem sent to me saying, "Come down and let us meet together." He said, but they had thought to do me harm. So their whole thing is, we got to do anything we can to stop Nehemiah. And so they say, hey, come on, let's just have a meeting. Let's just have a conversation. And Nehemiah has a special amount of discernment up to this point. He realizes they're up to no good. Nehemiah's response is classic and should be the response of anyone that the enemy is trying to distract from fulfilling God's will for their life. He says, I am doing a great work so that I cannot come down. Why should the work cease while I come or while I leave and go down to you? And so he sent that, and of course they kept on at this. But Nehemiah's focused determination, I think, is an example to each and every one of us. He realizes what's going on, and rather than allow himself to be distracted from the work, he kind of refocuses his energy on the work. The second thing they do is they try to spread lies. They basically accuse Nehemiah and his people of leading a rebellion against the Persians. Now, while I don't think this would have caught much ground with the Persians, in other words, I don't think this was actually going to be news that got back to, the Persian king, and then he would send, an army or something to suppress that rebellion. I do think it was intended to create some sort of discouragement among the people, and maybe to cause people to doubt Nehemiah's integrity and his leadership. As these lies are spread, the people are probably thinking to themselves, is this really what Nehemiah's doing? And if that's the case, the people are probably thinking, even though this probably wouldn't have happened, then that means Persia's going to catch wind of this, and they're going to come in and destroy this, probably kill us, haul us back off to, Persia, whatever. And this probably caused a tremendous amount of discouragement. Nehemiah's response is right on point. Rather than make a huge deal about it, how we are when we feel like we've been lied about, or maybe we've been slandered. We always feel like we've, got to retaliate in some way, or maybe we've got to, overly set the record straight. Nehemiah does a simple setting straight of the record. He basically says, this is not true. And then his response is one that every one of us should take into consideration, is he just simply prays. If you look at verse 9, it says that, now therefore, O God, strengthen my hands. Nehemiah just prayed a simple prayer, and then he trusted God to take care of the rest. How difficult is that when we know maybe our motives are being questioned, or maybe someone is spreading lies about us, things about us that aren't true? Here's the third thing. They try to trick Nehemiah. They send in basically an undercover op to suggest that Nehemiah is in danger. So if you're in danger, then let's run to the temple for safety. Again, Nehemiah shows his keenness, his awareness of what is going on. Here is the issue with that is, one, the temple is obviously considered sacred. And it was not to be entered without some elaborate purification rituals. And it was only the priest and the Levites who were allowed to minister in the temple. Nehemiah was of the tribe of Judah, I think. And so rather than try to save himself and run straight to the temple or panic, Nehemiah has a keen sense of awareness of what's going on. And it kind of reminds me of Satan's temptation to Jesus. He was like, just cast yourself off this temple. The angels will take you up. Everybody will then know of surety that you are this promised Messiah figure, right? And rather than do that, Jesus follows the will of God. He remembers the full and the whole counsel of God. While the Scripture does promise that he would send his angels to take us up lest we dash our foot against a stone, which is what Satan had quoted. He does also say, you should not tempt the Lord your God. In other words, don't do stupid stuff and just expect God to, bail you out. In this situation, it's kind of similar in the way Nehemiah responds. The human part of you would be like, yes, let me go in there and save myself. That's the practical thing. But then he understands the whole counsel of God. Look, I can't just run into the temple. That is a sacred place. And that kind of leads me to the personal application of this. How many of us, we know God has a call on our lives. We know God has a work for us to do. And maybe we start at that work. And maybe we're involved, engaged at church, or we're engaged in the community, or we're engaged in sharing our faith at work, whatever the case may be. And we allow ourselves to be distracted. And not just in the work, but maybe even in our relationship with God. So rather than spend as much time with God as we ought, we find ourselves distracted by our hobbies, or we're distracted by entertainment, Netflix, or whatever the case may be. Just anything else that would fill our lives as a distraction. We allow it to overtake that time we should be given to God, or to distract us from God's will and purposes for our lives. And I think this is where what the writer of Hebrews comes into play, where he says we are to keep our eyes on Jesus, the author and the finisher of our faith. We're to run that course, run that race, keeping our eyes on Jesus Christ. Don't let anything distract you. It's not to say that you can't have hobbies, or that you can't do things that you want to do or enjoy, or enjoy some form of entertainment or anything like that. But when those things become a deterrent to you fulfilling God's will, then that is a distraction that Satan is using to limit your impact and to allow you to not fully engage with God relationally. Here's the second thing, the lies. It is always human nature to try to respond to lies in our lives, usually by either slandering that other person, getting revenge, being reactionary. Nehemiah's response is classic. He does not respond by being reactionary. He does not slander them in return. He simply sets the record straight, then he prays. That shows me that he is trusting God. The first thing we want to do when our motives are questioned, or maybe we feel like we've been lied about, is jump on social media and make a big deal about it so we can get people on our bandwagon or whatever, or maybe we retaliate in some form and maybe we start spreading something about that other person. Even if it's true, that's not the way we should respond. Nehemiah's response again is classic. He just simply sets the record straight. No, that's not true. We're not trying to lead a rebellion. And then he prays and leaves it in the hands of God. God is his defender, and God fights his battles. That goes against all human inclination, but that is the way we should respond. Here's the last thing, is the trickery. Satan is always going to package worldly wisdom, I think, sometimes even in biblical terms. He's always going to, just like with Jesus, he says, just throw yourself, and it makes sense. Throw yourself off this temple. Everybody's going to see that the angels will come and grab you up, and then they'll know of a surety you're the Son of God, right? And that just makes sense. And we need to be aware that when Satan gives us that kind of worldly wisdom, things that seemingly make sense, not to say that common sense is something we should abandon, but we need to also be aware of the wisdom that God provides in his word. We need to brush up on our scriptures. We need to, figure out what God's will is in specific areas of our life. And because Nehemiah was aware of that, he was aware of the fact, I can't just run into the temple and save myself. It's a sacred place. I'm not even authorized to do that. And that leads to kind of really another lesson to be learned here is Nehemiah knew his place. Even though Nehemiah was the leader, even though he was the man in charge, he wasn't going to take upon himself, a position of authority that God didn't give him in going into the temple either. And so we need to make sure that we're full of the wisdom of God so that when the worldly or the satanic wisdom presents itself, looking all nice, looking very logical, looking like this is the way we ought to go, that we have the wisdom of God to combat that rather than fall prey to, our first inclination or what the world says is right. And as I look through these, there are a lot of ways that we can disrupt the work of the enemy and fulfill the will of God if we can be aware of the enemy's tactics. He is going to try to distract us. He may use lies to intimidate us or to nerf us in a sense. For example, you may hear the lie of the enemy, you're no good. Don't you remember everything you've done? You're not worthy to do this. Those are lies of the enemy that seek to keep you back from God's will for your life. And so we want to respond to those lies, and maybe with the fact that, yes, I am by faith. I am adopted into the family of God. I am a son of daughter of the Most High. And so we respond to those lies with truth. But in the same time, when we're lied about maybe by other people are being the mouthpiece of the enemy, at the same time, what we want to be able to do is simply respond with godly character. We don't want to get all up in an uproar and retaliate and seek to slander other people in response, but rather we set the record straight, pray to God, and allow him to take care of it. You'll find that oftentimes he is way better at that than we are. We, unfortunately, end up making things a lot worse. And then finally, we also want to have the wisdom of God. We need that wisdom to combat the wisdom of the world and the temptation of the enemy. I hope this helps. God bless.